Even more recently, under this government, we have BC5, which is called the One Canadian Economy Act. And it became law on June 26th. And it grants the federal government and essentially the prime minister the power to override existing laws and regulations for projects deemed in the so-called national interest. So what's problematic about that is that anybody can define what the national interest is. And so this is now giving this government unprecedented power to micromanage major projects. And people are concerned about it.
Many would argue on the other side of your argument that maybe it's a good time when government is crisis prone to actually centralize executive power so the government can have more power to execute projects and build more, do more. I don't know what you say about that.
I would say that's the exact time you don't want them to have more power.
The democracy is winning in Canada due to federal policy. I'm going to read a portion of this article just so that people can grab it and read it after. I would also tag it in the description. You said democratic backsliding often occurs not through democratic coups, but through the gradual erosion of institutions by elected leaders, presidents, and prime ministers alike, who subvert the very system that brought them into power. Sometimes this process is swift, as in Germany in 1933, but more often it unfolds slowly and almost imperceptibly. You referenced this decline, and I know you're referencing Germany in 1933 from the classic textbook on, is it textbook or book on how democracies die? That you also referenced in that article. But why do you make such an audacious claim?
Well, in part because I guess I worry about when government becomes such a big part of our society and they govern things that are outside of their area. And so, I mean, well, let's talk about the media, subsidies, for example. That's sort of because, again, everyone's attacks Donald Trump and they can legitimately attack him for always talking about fake news and delegitimizing journalists. My point in the article is that if you think about how the liberals did it, they were a lot more subversive in a way. They weren't as obvious how they did it. Trudeau gets in 2015, wonderful press, everyone loves him. He gets a minority government in 2019, sort of the honeymoon's over. And then, ironically enough, as the honeymoon's over, once he gets in 2019, he says, oh, there's a crisis in media. Let me give media some money. So he starts to subsidize the media. So we've always had a subsidized media. We've had the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which gets over $1 billion a year in subsidies. And that's not enough. And so now they start to subsidize the private sector journalists. And now the private sector is becoming more and more dependent on the government. They aren't changing their business model. They are basically saying, we need this money. And so subconsciously or consciously, it makes it much more difficult for journalists in the media that receive that to criticize the government, to be really critically evaluating them. They're no longer independent. So that's sort of a really sneaky way of doing it. And they said these were temporary. They said it was there so that they could save journalists' jobs. Well, companies that received the money didn't have to keep the jobs. In fact, many of them laid off employees, including the CBC. And now they're permanent, like $325 million for 24-25 went to subsidize. And then Carney, during the election campaign, says, and I'm going to give you guys another 150 more. He pledged more, right? So that becomes a campaign issue. So here you have one candidate saying, I'm going to subsidize and increase subsidies to media. And then the other leader saying, I'm not. And then if you look at the coverage between the two, some people have suggested that perhaps that's why Carney was not as critically scrutinized as was, say, Pierre Poilievre. And then there's sort of the Bill C-11, which was the bill under the previous government that wanted to extend CRTC rules for digital content. It sounded like they were going to regulate content providers like yourself, but then they realized the backlash was so great. So again, it was sneaky. They said, oh, okay, we're not going to be regulating any old podcast for speech. What we're going to do is we're going to regulate whoever you put it on. So YouTube or Google or whatever, and make them the police dogs so that they will be afraid. They have to be accountable for anything that you and I say, for example, on this podcast. So are we going to think about that when we have conversations? Are we going to be afraid that the government's going to say, well, she's being too negative towards the federal government and say we can't have these conversations? That hasn't happened yet. But in this world of contested speech, of everyone being hyper vigilant and, attacking everything you say, That's a worrisome. I am equally worried about a bill like that in Canada that could regulate internet speech, as I am in the United States with Donald Trump's chairman of the FCC making veiled threats against ABC because of Jimmy Kimmel's comments the other day. Both are wrong. It is not up to the government to be policing legitimate criticism, legitimate commentary. We can disagree. You can disagree with me. I can disagree with you. We can agree or disagree with Jimmy Kimmel. The point is, people should have the right to speak and they shouldn't be deplatformed as a result of it. And then, but even more recently, under this government, we have BC C5, which is called the One Canadian Economy Act. And it became law on June 26th. And it grants the federal government and essentially the prime minister the power to override existing laws and regulations for projects deemed in the so-called national interest. So what's problematic about that is that anybody can define what the national interest is. And so this is now giving this government unprecedented power to micromanage major projects. And people are concerned about it. I've spoken to many Indigenous leaders, for example, who are saying, wait a minute, we work so hard on reconciliation. We work so hard on the fact that it's agreed that there's a duty to consult with us for major projects. And now it looks like you're going to just steamroll over us. And so this government's setting itself up for some battles, and we'll have to see how they deal with those. And again, we may agree or disagree on whether we should have pipelines, but they do have an obligation to consult with Indigenous people and figure out a way to move forward without necessitating using that kind of power under Bill C5.
Many would argue that when government is in a crisis-prone year, like the period between the transition between Justin Trudeau's administration and the current administration, I think many people argue that that was sort of a crisis-prone year in government, because that's why we had parliament prorogation for so long, and then we had public dissatisfaction in government generally. The approval rating of that administration was terribly low. Many would argue on the other side of your argument that maybe it's a good time when government is crisis prone to actually centralize executive power so the government can have more power to execute projects and build more, do more. I don't know what you say about that.
I would say that's the exact time you don't want them to have more power, because that was a problem of their own making. So you're saying that, oh, when the people don't like me anymore, I should have more power to push through what I want to do? No, that's why we have elections. It's like they lost their mandate. They lost their credibility with the Canadian public. And so I don't care if the government has a crisis. The point is the country in crisis? And I would say it is not in crisis. Like, Justin Trudeau didn't have to resign. He could have just, the day that he resigned, he could have easily just said, you know what, I went to the Governor General, and instead of asking for prorogation, he could have asked for an election. He chose to put his party over the interests of the country. If the country were in such dire straits as they were claiming to be, then that's when we should have had the election. Instead, he said, oh, my party's in trouble. I gotta go. Here, let's stop doing all the work of government because it's such an important time. We're going to stop everything while the Liberals get their house in order, pick a new leader who will be more palatable for the Canadian public so that we can remain in power. I don't see how that is any different than some dictatorship that we've seen in other countries. I mean, that's sort of out of their playbook. We have to differentiate between a government crisis and a country in crisis. And I think all we saw was a government in crisis, and they should have less power, not more power in that, if that's the case.
But on the grounds of media, let me ask this opposing question to your perspective as well. The other side of the argument would say, do we want to platform neo-Nazis? I think the definition of such has become relative in our time as well, but that's another argument in itself. But they will say things like, do we want to platform a neo-Nazi? Do we want to give airtime to someone who makes a blatantly wrong argument or perspective? Maybe that's the reason why they believe censorship is a great idea for the safety of public discourse in the nation. I don't know what you think about that too.
So I hope it's clear, I would not want to platform a neo-Nazi group. I would not want to platform any hate speech either. But we have existing laws on that. We have hate speech provisions in our criminal code. You cannot incite violence against a group or people.